The topic for today is honoring what sustains us. And this question came up somewhere in about a couple of weeks ago, and talking about the idea of honoring what it is that we consume. Now, the reality is that all the living beings on the planet live by eating other things. It's just we have to do that until we become breatharians and we can just live off of the air. We're going to have to consume things. Now, from a shamanic perspective, that's really important, because the other piece of that is that we understand that everything is alive. And so we have a requirement to honor the things that we use and that we consume in order to take care of our daily lives. So I would like the opportunity to just sit and chat for a little bit about that. And if you have any questions, please, as always, feel free to drop a note in the chat, and I will try to leave some time afterward for anything that doesn't get answered in the discussion. So, okay. First thing I want to do is to drop back a little bit in time, and let's talk about how we got here. Now, humans from the beginning have been more hunters and gatherers. And tens of thousands of years ago, humans were in the food chain. We ate things and things ate us. And so everything tended to be sort of in balance. But the other piece of that is that because we couldn't get out of the food chain, we had an intimate understanding about how that food chain works. In other words, we knew that we were eligible to be food for something else. We also knew that what we ate, or what we brought into our bodies to sustain us, was a precious commodity. Sometimes the food wouldn't be there. Sometimes the herd wouldn't be there. And so as early humans, we were much more nomadic, and we tended to follow the herds around rather than be fixed in place and have the food come to us. Okay, so that setting, that arrangement, made things so that whatever we did in terms of our interaction with our environment and with nature and with all the beings in nature had a sacred quality to it. Now, something happened around 12,000 to 10,000 years BC. We stopped doing that. That's the time of what is known as the first agricultural revolution. That's the time whenever humans stopped chasing the herds and began to put roots down for themselves in a location. And we began to domesticate plants and animals. In other words, we brought the food to us. And we began then to take care of that on a one-to-one basis. But we were no longer chasing the herds. Now, there was a cost to that. Part of the cost was that we lost that connection that we had with all the other beings in nature. The other thing is that when we did that, we essentially pulled ourselves out of that natural environment. And even though we gained some level of security, some level of control over our lives and our food and other things, it separated us in a significant way from the rest of nature. Now, it's arguable that our relationship to the plants and animals that we were growing continued to have a sacred quality. I mean, as you're taking care of animals, you're taking care of your plants, and you're ensuring their growth and their development, it makes sense that the humans would have a continuing one-to-one relationship with their food. It's like right here. It's on your property, or it's on the place where you're living. And so it's very likely that the connection between humans and the animals or the other beings that we were consuming had a more sacred and special quality. Now you'll notice that I'm talking about not just animals, but all the beings. And that's important because you see, plants also are alive. Plants also have a sentience about them. We know that from studies that have been done that measure the response of plants to a variety of different kinds of stimuli, not just heat and cold and wet and dry. But plants also respond to things like music. They respond when you talk to them, when you communicate with them. So to some extent, they have an ability to interact with us, although we don't necessarily recognize that or use it on a day-to-day basis unless we know about it. And we can then begin to develop a relationship with the plants. Now, it's also true that whenever you harm a plant in one place, a plant in another place will also react. Now, I do not know how far apart that can get, but studies with humans in terms of our ability to communicate with each other at a distance is by miles. Okay, so it's reasonable then that plants have a sentience that allows them to be aware of what's going on around them much more than we would ordinarily consider. And that's important. Okay, now, people who do plants, by the way, also know that there are some plants that you can plant together because they like each other, but there are some plants that you can't plant together because they don't like each other. Okay? So now we have expanded the concept of consuming food for our own well-being beyond just meat, animals. We are now including plants as also being sentient and therefore being eligible to be recognized and to be honored for their contribution to your livelihood. So that being said, and looking at the history, going back to the beginning of the agricultural revolution, it's very likely that that kind of relationship could develop and continue. Now, if we move forward in time, let's move up to around 1750 to 1850, somewhere around in there. Something happened that was quite a change for humans as well, and that's the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, what happened was that we moved from handmade objects to machine-made objects. And the impact of that in itself was astonishing. The population went up, the standard of living went up, and we began to produce more and more and more because we were then freed from individual creative work, and the creation work, the building work was given to machines. And of course, the cost of that was multifaceted. It changed our relationship to time, for one thing, because then humans became part of the machine. They were the ones who were there to run and service the machine, and they had to do that on a scheduled basis. And so we get things like clocking in and clocking out so that we get an exchange for that. Okay, so we're making more money, there's more population, and so the needs for more food increased. At the same time, populations began migrating from farms toward towns and cities. So you can see then that on the whole, humans were beginning to pull even further out of the food chain and separating ourselves even more from the source of what sustains us. So we find ourselves now at a place in which very few of us actually raise the food that we eat. There are a number of people who have gardens, for example. Some have very large gardens. I have a friend who's got a lot of produce that she grows, and she gives it all away because she can't eat it all. Okay, so it is possible to do that for yourself if you have the land and you have the time and you have the resources. And if you live in a town or a city, you may also be able to have livestock. People in our neighborhood have chickens, for example, and so the chickens provide eggs, and eventually they provide either money for being sold or food that the owner can use for themselves. Okay, and that's one relationship away. But if we look at how humans in cities, particularly the huge cities like Austin, New York, on the coast and so on, there is a vast separation between the source of the food and me. And from a shamanic perspective, we have to pay attention to that. Because again, if everything is alive, everything is up for honoring. Now, the question then becomes, if we're so separated from our food source, how do we do the honoring? What can we do about that? And here's a suggestion. Everything that exists, all the beings have a boundary. Humans have boundaries. Plants have boundaries. The animals have boundaries. Everything has a boundary. For humans, it extends roughly as large a bubble, if you want to think of it that way, as you can touch with your arms outstretched, just a little bit beyond, and in all directions, not just left and right, forward and back, but above and below. We all have boundaries. And those boundaries surround living beings, your plants, your pets, everything. Now, in order for us to consume that plant or that meat, we have to bring it into our sphere. We have to bring their boundary into our boundary in order for us to consume the energy that is provided by the source, by that food. Now, then the question becomes, how do you negotiate the crossing of the boundaries? How do you do that? And the best answer I can think of for that is through gratitude. Expressing gratitude to the being that you're bringing into your sphere is an important way of communicating your appreciation, your understanding of the sacrifice that's being made on your behalf. That being has sacrificed or has been sacrificed, but I tend to think of it more as they have done it by choice, has sacrificed itself so that you can have the energy that you need in order to grow and to exist in the first place. So there's a suggestion. However, it goes even further than that. Remember how far separated that humans are in large cities, but not just in cities, from the food source. Because we don't grow our own food, there is a chain that's maybe a long chain of boundaries being crossed. In other words, this plant or this animal lives in a garden or a farm or a ranch somewhere out there. And what is important about that is that as a shamanic practitioner, it's important as you can to know the source, to know where they are and how they're being treated. The beings who are not being treated well carry a different kind of energy than the beings that are mistreated. And so it behooves us to know as much as we can about where that food comes from and how it's being treated. Then we get an understanding of the boundaries at the other end of that chain so that we know how the beings at the end of the chain are treating each other. And then when the time comes to harvest that food, we want to know how that's done. Because there's some places that we know where that harvesting is not optimal, to say the least, that it can be harmful. And if that boundary, that transaction happens in a negative way, the energy of that is different than if that harvesting is done with respect. So now we have that boundary that needs to be addressed as well. And that's not the end of the chain, of course. That food is going to have to be processed somewhere. And so there's a transition that happens between the farm or the ranch to the processor. There's a transaction. And it behooves us to know who the processor is and how they do that. Then, once it's processed, then for most of us, it has to get to some place where we can go and get it. And that involves distribution. Now, the distribution is another transaction. As the harvested food makes that transition to your market or your supermarket, that transaction also includes other beings, truck drivers, people who load the food, people who take it off of the trucks, who move it into the market. See, there's a lot of transactions that are going on there. A lot of things are happening. And so we look at that as a set of transactions that moves the food closer to us. Okay, so now we trace the food to our market or to our supermarket. What kind of supermarket is it? Where is it? How are the beings that work there? How do they behave? What is their respect for what they're doing? That's another important piece of this puzzle, because every step along the way, ideally, will be done with respect and gratitude. I don't know to what extent that actually happens. I rather doubt that it happens often, but it can happen. So now let's take it this way, that you then go and you pick up your food. Then there's that transaction. And so it behooves you to know who the market person is and how they behave. Then it gets to you. And then you get to handle that transaction. Now, the energy of the being has not actually disappeared in all of this. It's part of that transaction. And so by the time it gets to you and it's time for you to prepare the food and to eat it, to consume it, that also needs to be done with some degree of respect and gratitude, honoring. Okay, so now you see that there is a lot of chains there. There's a lot of transactions that happen between the source and you. And now, as a shamanic practitioner, it's likely that I can't get all of the information that I need. It's likely that I will never know the farmer or the rancher. However, it is very possible to shorten that chain, to make it shorter, so there are fewer transactions in between. A farmer's market comes to mind, where the food is grown locally and the distribution chain is much shorter. Then you go to the farmer, you go to the producer directly, and that transaction can happen with a lot more respect and appreciation, more gratitude, than just going to the supermarket and buying something that was grown in California. Okay, so that's one idea, to pay attention to what you can get more locally in order to minimize all the different kinds of transactions that may or may not go well in between you and the source. You can also check with the restaurants and cafes, because a number of them in the Austin area that I know of have a list of the local farmers that they work with, the local producers. They will say on a wall, there's a place in town that has listed on their wall, here are the people that we buy from. So we get a chance to look at that. The menus of some places have the same thing. It's like, here's the people that we buy from. All of that goes toward the idea of cleaning up the transactions between the food source, the being, and you. All right, so what we have to do in order to do all of this well is to be aware and to be grateful for everything all along that chain. That is important, because it's a way that we bring our spirit into the transactions all the way down. So given that you don't necessarily have all the information that you might want or need, what you can do, just as you are preparing the food, is to be aware of what you're doing. And whenever it comes time to actually consume it, take a little bit of time to express gratitude, not just to what you're eating, but to the entire chain. I try to remember all of those different steps of the transactions, and I try to express my gratitude for any honoring that happened along that way. And I believe that that's one way that we can express our appreciation, our gratitude, and also honor the beings that we have to consume in order to stay alive. So that is pretty much the core of what it is that I wanted to express or to share with you today. And I hope that it makes sense. Now, do you have any questions? I see that there's one question here. Let me take a moment. I think I may have answered that one about how can we honor the spirit of something that may or may not have been harvested in the best way. Again, it's by honoring that transaction. It's by honoring the fact that, in essence, that being, plant or animal, has sacrificed itself for us, for me. And I do believe that by doing that, we honor the being and bring it into our ourselves for our own energy. Now, I also want to address that there is sort of a bias, and I'm not disagreeing with it at all, that plants are better for us to eat than our animals. Now, I think part of that is that we tend to think of the plant beings as not being quite as sentient as the animal beings. But as I said earlier, there's a lot of good research that shows that they do feel. Now, that doesn't mean that eating plants is better or worse than eating meat or vice versa. There's a whole lot more to it than that. At least part of it is that the cleaner that the food is, the better for our body it is. And by cleaner, I'm not talking about dirty. I'm talking about the kinds of the chemicals and interactions that happen between meat and plants and the human form. It is rather important that we also tune into what our bodies are telling us that they want and they need. I do know some people who must, because of their physiology, eat meat. They have to have that kind of protein. One woman I know can't tolerate vegetables hardly at all. On the other hand, I know people who the heaviness of meat harms them. and they feel heavy. They don't operate well unless they are eating a more clean diet that is easier to digest kind of diet. So personally, I don't make any distinction between any of the foods that can be consumed. I personally eat very little of red meat. It just doesn't make me feel very good. And also, I'm suspicious as to how that particular being might have been treated. But it is more important, I think, for this discussion to recognize that even if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, it's not that you're eating something that doesn't need to be honored. That being also sacrificed itself on your behalf. Okay, let me take a moment and see if I can read this question. Yes, John, I completely agree with you. I think that would be the ideal. And if you have the capability to grow your own food, that again, that's the shortest chain possible. And as I mentioned with my person who has a large garden, she has an ongoing relationship with the plants that she plants and harvests from. She also has an ongoing relationship with the land because the garden itself is well taken care of. And it's good because that allows her that the clarity of that interaction. It's a transaction as well, you see, because the transaction between the earth and the plant is also important. Everything comes from the earth. And so whenever we do that remembrance, we can also include the earth because the earth has given us so much bounty. The earth has given us the things that literally sustain us for air, for food, for temperature, all of it. And so in my personal opinion, we should always express our gratitude to Mother Earth as well as all the other things, the other beings. So yes, I do agree with you. I appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you, and I totally appreciate the fact that you are continuing to create and develop your own shamanic practice, your own way of being in the world that has a lot to do with returning humans to that connection to nature that we surrendered over 40,000 years ago. Okay, so good for you. I appreciate it.